to episode 196 of the Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable podcast. This show was recorded on Wednesday, August 1st, 2018.
The Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable podcast is brought to you by Jensen USA, where you'll always find a great selection of products at amazing prices with unparalleled customer service. For more information, just go to jensenusa.com/thespokesman. Hey everybody, it's David from the Fredcast Cycling Podcast at www.thefredcast.com. I'm one of the hosts and producers of the Spokesmen Cycling Roundtable Podcast. For show notes, links, and all sorts of other information, please visit our website at www.the-spokesmen.com. And now, here are the Spokesmen.
Hi there, I'm Carlton, Reid of BikeBiz.com, and first off, I've got an apology to make. The RSS feed for this show isn't working as it should. Episode 195 has yet to appear in the feed, and for the life of me I can't work out why. However, it will get fixed. I just don't know when. So, if you're listening from the website, or clicking the Libsyn play button, or perhaps downloading the MP3 directly, then you're all good. But the last episode isn't yet available in iTunes or other podcast aggregators, so sorry about that. Okay, back to today, and I chatted with Chris and Melissa Bruntlett of Vancouver, Canada. We spent an hour talking about their new book, which is an exploration of why Dutch people cycle so much, and how that can be exported elsewhere in the world. I am reading a book at the moment, digitally that is, because it's not physically, I think it is physically out, but I haven't got a physical copy of it. But I've been sent a PDF of it by Island Press, who published my books too. And that book is called Building the Cycling City, The Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality. And it is by Melissa and Chris Bruntlett, who are squeezed over a machine at the moment, talking to me from Vancouver, Canada. It's good afternoon for me, but it's good morning for you. So hi there, how's it going?
Good, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. So we have met in the flesh. You were very kind with you and your children. You gave us a micro tour of Vancouver. 6 months ago?
It was last July. It was 12 months ago.
12 months ago. Oh my word. Okay, doesn't time fly? So at that point, Chris and Melissa, you were still working on this book. So now it's physically. It's out, yes? It's like at the end of the month technically, but there are physical copies right now.
That's correct, yeah. We the official release date is August the 28th, but through some miracle of publishing, the copying, editing, and production process went so quickly that they started shipping books almost 8 weeks before the release date. And so there's a lot of online outlets that have stock that are shipping, and the only exception to that, I believe, is Amazon, which waits until the physical release date before they start shipping their books. Okay.
Now, I also saw you in the Netherlands at the last Velocity. Not the last Velocity, because that was in Brazil, wasn't it? But the last European Velocity, so the last cycle advocacy conference that was taking place in Europe. And presumably you went on from there to do some of the research for your book.
The research actually started the year prior. So on our first trip there in 2016, we were there for 5 weeks, and from that we wrote a series of articles for a local online publication called Daily Hive. But a lot of what we what we saw and experienced, we weren't able to fit into the 1,500 words per city. So that ended up becoming the preliminary research and the pitch for the book. And then when we went back to Velocity, it was firming up some of those contacts to beef out what we wanted to talk about a little bit more, and
discovering new storylines too. I mean, there were. We, for example, stumbled across the city of Austin's work with the Dutch Cycling Embassy, which we had no idea was taking place, but they were working quite closely with them on a bicycle master plan with Dutch cycling experts. So it was neat to explore the storylines we had in our minds, but also to discover new ones that we wanted to explore in the book. And the Velo City Conference was the perfect venue for that.
Mm-hmm.
And you had your kids with you when you've been doing this research for the book, and you went to the Netherlands. You had your kids with you at this point, and you were all cycling around as a family.
Yeah, that first trip, we did 5 weeks, 5 cities, and it was a family adventure. So the whole idea was to essentially spend the time living like the Dutch as much as we could, coming from, Canada and only living in places for, a week or a week and a half at a time. But yeah, we cycled in every single city. The kids took to it very easily. And yeah, we enjoyed just sort of living and experiencing the cities as a family.
Now, Vancouver is kind of some way down the road, some way down the cycle path, in fact, at having a kind, I'm not saying it's a Dutch culture, but it's a pretty good place to ride a bike. I mean, there are obvious parts where it's not good, but there's some beautiful places to ride a bike in Vancouver. Presumably, you're looking to have this book read by people who are not living in places like Vancouver, other places in North America, other places, like, for instance, like in the UK, where the template you're talking about needs to come at a much higher level than, in, say, in Vancouver.
Yeah, we do see the applications here in Vancouver, because what we like to think is, our Vancouver has come quite far, but we don't want, city planners and city officials to start resting on their laurels, and we want them to keep pushing beyond. And, the Netherlands becomes a perfect example of how they can keep pushing forward. But yeah, in terms of other cities, what we really hoped is that our book is something that, someone within the urbanist community or cycling community could read it, understand it, and see how, if they were to pass it on to a city councillor who knows nothing about cycling infrastructure, could read it and understand the concepts in it. And so that's what our goal really was, is to reach the people that aren't already drinking the Kool-Aid like us bikey people and can understand the concepts that the Dutch are the Dutch have created a perfect example for and a perfect blueprint for.
Mm-hmm. So that blueprint, which is in the title of the book, so the rest of the book is you're talking to people, basically. You are going around and you are chatting to experts and non-experts, and just trying to drill down into what are the building blocks for creating a Dutch cycling culture. Yeah, a city that is built around bikes.
That's correct. Yeah, and it's not all brick and mortar stuff. I mean, there's cultural contributing factors from the way the culture or the society approaches cycling, the type of bikes that they ride, the political willingness to kind of put your neck out and start thinking beyond the next political cycle. And I think what everybody thinks about when it comes to how the Dutch got their cycle pass is this collective activism that they really pioneered in the 70s, and said when the modernist planners came along to start retrofitting their cities for the automobile, they really, in a lot of ways, put their foot down and said, no, we want to retain these human scale cities for the most part, and we're quite successful in resisting that urge to build large parking lots, tall buildings, wide streets, as we've done perhaps elsewhere in the world.
So the Netherlands has been the world's top cycling nation since 1911, at least. And that's when it started, really getting into its infrastructure big time. So that's an awfully long time ago. We were talking like 110 years. So the Netherlands is 110 years ahead of most other places. So how can you even start to replicate a 110-year journey?
I think it starts with recognizing that, the Dutch aren't perfect, and they almost went down a very similar path that we did. For example, Rotterdam, once after the bombing, they had a blank canvas and were able to start building that modernist city. But then in the 70s realized, the citizens at least realized, this was the wrong way forward and course corrected. But I think even further, even more beyond that, what we discovered throughout our research was that it's not a matter of it being completely perfect for every city. Every city has these contextual lessons that can be applied even in the smallest scale in North America to start building on that. Just understanding building cycle tracks to connect people to short trips, whether that's to schools or shopping, or, citizens standing up and saying, this isn't what we want, and keeping that pressure on local officials to recognize the importance of providing safety for people and calming the car and making more space for walking and cycling. We are, in the rest of the Western world, pretty far behind where the Dutch are, but what they provide is sort of an example that you can get there, and it's not about a copy-paste solution. It's about finding the solutions that make sense for your given city, whether you're more of a suburban town or a large city center. There are ways of starting to integrate this into how we design our streets and how we design our cities.
Yeah, and I think Miriam from the Dutch Cycling Embassy actually said it best in that, the Dutch achieved this success over 100 years, but there's no reason that we can't learn from their mistakes and do it even faster. But that does require analyzing where they got it right and where they got it wrong, and then hopefully implementing these lessons and these building blocks in a more accelerated manner than perhaps they did.
And how's that going to happen? Is it political will? Is it money? Is it cultural? Where do you think it's, or tick all of the above?
I do think it's a combined effort of all of the above. I think we're seeing a lot of citizen activism in cities that are demanding more from their politicians. And that needs to be a sustained effort. But then there also needs to be the recognition from our leaders that what might seem like an unpopular decision to put in cycle tracks or start building or creating spaces that are safer for cycling might seem, like political suicide, for lack of a better expression. There is this quiet majority that really, whether they're going to bike or walk or drive or take transit, they do want cities that are better places to live, work, and play. And so, pushing forward, like here in Vancouver, like our mayor, who was elected in 2008 and then subsequently elected 2 more times, he ran on a platform of putting in cycle tracks, and it seemed like that would be the demise of his political career within year 1. And here we are 3 terms later, and only now, because he's stepping down, is he not going to be our mayor again. So there is just that recognition, I think, that needs to happen in politicians that, it's not going to be the end of the world, and, making decisions that are better for your constituents in terms of healthy living and healthy lifestyles will in the end be quite a popular decision. And then, I think there does need to be that cultural shift. I think we've gotten into a very, detrimental cycle of being, sorry for the pun, but this detrimental path of being so focused on sport and commuting to work and this really aggressive form of cycling outside of the Netherlands. And I think just a recognition that cycling isn't for the fit and the brave and can be done by anyone at any age of any, mobility means to, it's totally accessible and something that we can all do.
So that's in the Netherlands, say. But when you translate that to, I'm obviously looking at this from a UK point of view and a North American point of view, it can often come across as a almost gentrification. It's a white middle class thing to put in cycle infrastructure. This is for not for young blacks. This is something that's for affluent people, in effect. Does that ever exercise you? That is even if it isn't the case, it's certainly what an awful lot of people think is the case.
Yeah, I think it's, even here in Vancouver, I think we get frustrated now because we've done so well at building out the infrastructure in our downtown and in our more affluent areas, but really the people that need those mobility options are the people that are living with lower incomes and need more options. And I think in that respect, we need to be looking at ways of providing better funding and making sure we're supporting those communities that need the mobility options, just in the way that we should be providing them with accessible transit. We should be doing the same thing with providing them different options. And I think that just takes some foresight, and it takes proper planning, proper zoning. It's a whole bigger thing that we have the solutions to. But I think it's, it's hard to avoid gentrification in the Western world context. But I think there needs to be, proper, the word is escaping me, like flip. If, in politics, they have to make special policies. That's the word I'm looking for.
Okay.
Policies to make sure they're protecting those communities.
Social inclusion.
Exactly. Social inclusion is very, very important. And making sure that we're providing not just the housing, but also the transportation options, and, protecting those people so that they don't feel they're being pushed out, which is difficult. I mean, it's happening here in Vancouver, and, we will unfortunately probably fall victim to it eventually ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a recognition in recent years that urban planning is really something that's only being done by and for the people that show up to the meetings. Mm-hmm. And there's been a distinct shift, at least we've seen, to get out into communities and actually go to where people live, work, and play, and engage with those people, and try to involve them in the decision-making process. And hopefully that will lead to more inclusive planning process, but there's no doubt that it's been a concern and an issue up to this point.
Do you think any communities, perhaps of colour, perhaps not, will be worried that what you're trying to do is get people out of cars, and what in fact those communities want? They want cars, and they haven't got them maybe, and they want them, and by having this middle class white perception agenda going, that would actually prevent them doing what they want to do, which is drive everywhere.
Yeah, we came across this when we were writing the book, and we kind of spent the first 9 chapters in the backs of our minds. We kept hearing, well, the immigrant population in the Netherlands doesn't cycle as much as the regular, born and bred Dutch people. And that was something we were hearing over and over and again. So in the final chapter, we finally kind of delved into this idea, and we spoke to Angela van de Kloof, who just teaches cycling to immigrants and refugees in the Netherlands. And she made this point that really resonated with us, and that is that there's no inherent value system or cultural belief that people coming to the Netherlands want mopeds or cars or any kind of status symbol that we may project onto them. All they want is the freedom to move, and they want mobility, and they do want to integrate themselves with society. And so she found that the immigrants were coming to the government and asking for these cycling lessons as a way to get around their city. And she, poignantly said that just because you're Muslim or Asian, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are coming to the country with a different set of needs or desires. That everybody has the same set of needs and desires, and that's basically just to get around the city comfortably and safely. She also made the point that virtually any country, if you're coming from any country to the Netherlands, whether it's Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK, or Morocco, or Indonesia, or Afghanistan, more often than not, you're coming from a place that doesn't cycle, where cycling isn't a normal activity. So there is going to be a period of adjustment there, but I think the way that we project our stereotypes and our beliefs onto certain cultural groups is fascinating, and maybe isn't accurate if we just stop to listen to what they have to say.
I mean, in the end, they're all just people that are trying to get from point to B as efficiently and pragmatically as possible. And one of the things that, we do like to emphasize when we're talking about implementing a lot of these tactics that they've done in the Netherlands is cycling isn't the silver bullet for transportation solutions. It's about creating a cohesive system where public transportation, cycling, walking, and driving are all part of a seamless transportation option. And so the idea is to provide the options to the people that want them. And so if there are people that want to drive and are going to drive all the time, then what essentially is happening is you're creating the options for people that don't and making space for the people that do. So it's not about excluding, the desires of how one person wants to get around over another. It's about creating options for everybody.
So you're not looking at forcing everybody to ride bikes. Is that a fear?
No.
People think, I don't want to ride a bike. Don't force me.
Yeah, and I think, we make this point over and over again. I don't think we didn't fall in love with the Netherlands because of the cycling, and that sounds kind of counterintuitive and silly, but really what keeps us going back there and what really pushed us to write this book was by building cycling cities, the Dutch have inadvertently just built better cities that are quieter, that are more pleasant, that are free for children to roam. So whether you ride a bike or not is kind of irrelevant. By slowing down the cars, by reducing the volume of cars, by giving people options, and creating more pleasant public space, everybody wins in that scenario. It's not just about the quote unquote cyclist or the people that want to ride bikes.
Chris, you've also just described what in North American terms would be a socialist country. In that the Netherlands, I mean, it's not quite the same. In fact, it definitely isn't the same in the UK. But say countries like the Netherlands, from a North American perspective, are pretty much communist states in that they look after their citizens, and that's the government's job. And people pay quite high taxes in these countries to have a socialized medicine system, to have a socialized cradle-to-grave social security system. Now, I'm sure Canada is different to North America, but just looking at this, because Island Press is an American, it's a Washington DC publisher. So looking at this from an American perspective, how do you see your socialist, communist cycling utopia going across in a capitalist country that is a lot of the socialist communist things? It's not actually socialist communist, but anyway, that's the way many people would view it. Mm-hmm. Would come across it in that way.
I think
you've raised a tremendous point. And we went to a screening of the beautiful documentary Why We Cycle a few weeks ago, and the mayor of Kelowna got up, and kind of his immediate reaction to the film was, well, in order to make that happen here, we'd have to change two things, and that's remove everything from the zoning code and create a free-for-all, and then remove capitalism,
yes.
Basically overthrow the capitalist system. So there's obviously certain cultural things that are barriers, or at least perceived barriers. But we've been reflecting a lot on how Western Canadian cities seem to have been embracing cycling a lot more in recent years. You've got Vancouver kind of led the way, but then Calgary and Edmonton and Winnipeg and Victoria followed suit. And they're not just building, one or two cycle tracks. They're building out entire networks of cycle tracks. So maybe that speaks to the cultural difference between the Canadians and the Americans. And we're actually, going to be doing a lot of press and speaking engagements in the U.S. over the next few weeks. So we're interested to see where the conversation takes us and what it is inherently perhaps about U.S. culture and cities that makes them a little more hostile to these kinds of concepts and ideas.
But I don't think they're necessarily held on. There's a barrier between them, because we did see cases of, in Atlanta, they're looking at how to combine bike and transit. And so these ideas are starting to permeate. Austin is putting in a cycling network for those smaller, under 3 mile trips. Portland was for a time leading the way, and hopefully with all these other cities starting to catch up, it'll be a nice little kick in the butt for them. So we are seeing these pockets of it happening, and even New York City building, taking the mean streets of New York and starting to take back some of that space and give it to people. It's happening. It might not be happening as fast as, say, here in Canada or even in the UK, but I think, inherently, like even when it comes to the cultural stuff we were just talking about, Americans still want to enjoy their cities and they still want places to spend time, spend money. They don't inherently want their cities to be dominated by cars. But I think, you're absolutely right. There is a little bit of that, here in Canada, we do think a little more about helping each other, whereas they're still on that journey. And hopefully they can, in the next 4 to 6 years, start to correct themselves a bit. But everyone we talk to there, they all, arguably, yes, they do sit left of center, but most of them still want those livable cities. And, hopefully that our book can provide a little bit of inspiration for that and a little bit of forward thinking that they can use even to make baby steps to get a little bit further along.
I'm trying to think where I saw this, but talking about like communism and how, cycling is considered, that mayor you've just talked about, something you'd have to get rid of capitalism. Whereas you actually look at what the amenities and the provision and the luxuries people in the UK and the US and of course in Canada give to cars, well, that's pretty much a communist society in that cars get everything. Cars just are allowed to ride roughshod over everything. So that's pretty much, cars equal communism.
Yeah, there was a great headline. I think it was in City Observatory was, the Americans are dead set against communism except when it comes to parking their automobiles.
Yeah, there we go. That was definitely where I was. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, so if we can do it for cars, then by extrapolation, you can do it for bikes, yeah?
Yeah, hopefully. I think the fear we have now, and it was actually, it's the same concerns that we heard through the colleagues that we interviewed in the Netherlands, is what role does autonomous technology play in that? And so that's sort of the next, I think, chapter for a lot of cities around the world, is what, as self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles become part of the social fabric of our cities, what does that mean in terms of the space that we've allocated? Because right now in most North American cities, there's tons of space for them and people see it as the solution for transportation options, but aren't necessarily recognizing that it's trading one problem for another and not solving the problem of creating the livable cities. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see how that starts. It's already happening in Silicon Valley. So we'll see how that plays a role. But hopefully before they take over, we can start to recognize maybe if we just carve out a bit more space for walking and cycling, or even use this as an opportunity to have that space, because the demands on parking will be less if we have cars roaming around waiting for the next pickup. But yeah, some interesting conversations that we had around that and are still having with people in our circles is, what does autonomy mean in terms of the future of mobility?
Mm-hmm. So in your book, one of the chapters is how cycling is transport, not just a sport. So where do you see existing hardcore spandex / lycra cyclists fitting into your worldview?
Yeah, I think we perhaps fairly get a bad rap for disparaging that type of cycling, and we have to always point out, well, we're not against that type of cycling. Those people are already riding a bike, and that's great. But the important point we must make is that that type of cycling only will appeal to a certain minority of the population. And the fact that the Dutch have two different words for cyclists kind of makes that distinction between the walking with wheels and the running with wheels. There's still room on their streets for both type of cyclists, but the fact that the casual, everyday, upright person riding around without a helmet and in their street clothes. The fact that cyclist dominates their streets just speaks volumes to how accessible and normal cycling is and how safe and comfortable it's been made. So we should be, in all of these kind of urban planning decisions being taken that interested but concerned audience into consideration, and those people on the road bikes that are cycling for sport or exercise or just commuting with a little bit more bravado will certainly keep on riding, but it's the other type of quote unquote cyclist that we have to foster and encourage.
And that's what cities are measuring. Those that are putting in infrastructure is they're measuring the number of children riding, the number of women and elderly riding, or people of various minorities that they're starting to see come out because they've been provided with a safer space to ride, and because it's being presented as something that is more accessible. And so it's not just about creating a safe space, but it's about making it more inclusionary and more accessible to everybody. Whereas, we talk to people in Vancouver that I've been riding since before there were bike lanes. And we always say, that's wonderful, keep riding. But this stuff is for the people that didn't want to do that because they didn't feel comfortable riding in traffic, or riding, at top speeds for 30 kilometers a day each way. That's great for you, but this isn't for you. This is for the people that wouldn't do it otherwise.
Sure. So, Chris, you mentioned the sit up and beg bike, the kind of the typical Dutch bike, and that's also, it features on the front cover of your book, kind of the archetypal Dutch bike. We know that that's actually an English bike of the early 1900s, but however, I'm not going that way. This kind of bike, I'm talking from an industry point of view here. So that kind of bike is a fascinating bike, is a wonderful bike. It's a practical bike. It's a bike that obviously is perfect for the Netherlands and is almost a lifestyle kind of bike elsewhere. Do you think that kind of bike can survive outside of the Netherlands, in that it's very practical for the Netherlands for the very reasonably obvious reasons that it's kind of flat? How can that type of bike be translated into cities where it's very different? It's not flat. It's not the same kind of place.
So one of the things that we've started to witness is that while it's still a small portion of the market, there are bike manufacturers that see the benefit of the more upright, more practical way of being positioned on a bike, and are taking that and designing it in a way that makes sense for these cities. Like Vancouver, for example. We have a lot of hills here, and it's a frequent excuse is I can't ride a bike like that because I have to go up hills. And so they're taking this practical design and evolving it and adapting it in a way that makes sense. So I ride a bike that was actually designed in Australia with 3 speeds. It's lighter weight, and it is still an upright bike, but I can ride it from the waterfront up to our home in East Vancouver quite comfortably. And so I'm seeing more and more of my friends asking me, where do I get a bike like that? How do I get upright?
Because Melissa, what is that bike? What kind of bike you got?
The brand is Papillionaire. Like papillon with air, like millionaire at the end. Mm-hmm. And so people will test out my bike and they're like, oh, this is great. I'm so much more comfortable. And so they can find, there are other brands. We've got Simcoe, which is a brand out of Toronto. Linus has done quite well from California. And a lot of other brands that are starting to bring this more Dutch-style model of bike into an outside of Netherlands context. So they're usually a little bit lighter. They probably have a few more speeds, but they still have that comfortable riding position.
Or they might have electric assist, which is the next generation.
I kind of thought that's where you would go in that. Is a hill? Okay, put an electric motor on it. That'll get you up the hill.
When we actually spoke to you for this chapter, Carlton, and you really presented us with a dilemma, and I don't think it's a dilemma that we actually resolve by the end of the chapter, is the there's a certain segment of the population that does want these upright city bikes, but it's not enough of a demand for the shops to dedicate retail floor space and train their staff on them. And so, we kind of see that as a bit of a barrier because, and Vancouver's a great example. You walk into any bike shop here and they may have one or two city bikes kind of sitting off in the corner, and their staff aren't really trained to deal or sell you the bike that you necessarily want. So there's a bit of a gap between perhaps what people want or what they think they want. And we really don't know if that gap is, if we're able to bridge that gap without, some kind of a real push from the bike manufacturers to more utilitarian machines.
I think it works both ways in that bike shops, and I've been around this industry quite a long time, so I've seen some of these changes happen. Bike shops used to be told off for not selling mountain bikes, so they were only selling road bikes. And then when enough people asked for mountain bikes, they sold mountain bikes, because bike shop owners, they're not stupid. They will sell what people want. So if people came in and wanted Dutch bikes, they would sell lots and lots of Dutch bikes. So what they're seeing is not that many people. They're seeing some people asking for Dutch bikes, but not enough to make them change the whole strategy of their shop floor. But, you look at bike shops, 30 years ago, and it was just road bikes. But then it changed and it was just mountain bikes. And now you go into a typical bike shop, and I would say folding bikes are a huge category now, which wasn't the case, 10 years ago. A folding bike, you'd have one Brompton in the corner, if that. Now you've got, turns, you've got Dahons, you've got Bromptons, coming out of your ears. It's just amazing what bike shops are stocking now. So they can change. But my point is, they're not the stick in the muds here. It's the consumer. It's the bike shops will sell what consumers want. So you haven't got to change bike shops alone. In fact, you probably have to change the consumer first, because the bike shop will sell what the consumer wants at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we make this point when we spoke to Firth and Wilson Transport Cycles in Philadelphia, as they saw, once the bike share scheme went out there and people were able to ride upright bikes, that was one tool that kind of brought people in the shop looking for them, because all of a sudden they can experience a different type of cycling and a more comfortable bicycle. And I don't think it's a coincidence that virtually every bike share scheme around the world you see is the step-through frame, is an upright riding posture. Again, it may be a slightly adapted version with a lighter frame and gears, 3, 5, 7 gears, but this kind of tried and tested design and riding position has lasted this long for a reason, because it really is perhaps the most practical way to just do a slow roll around your city.
And it's amazing. I find the number of people that I talk to. It just happened to me last week. I was talking to someone about my bike, and they had said they had just been to California and had ridden an upright bike, and they were amazed at how much more comfortable it was. And so most of us grew up not riding these bikes, at least, here in North America, and I'm assuming the UK as well. And then once they experience it, they recognize it's actually a lot more comfortable to ride this way. And so as more and more people do that through the bike share schemes, through, renting bikes at various cities when they're visiting, they start to recognize that. And then, hopefully then that demand will start to come to the bike shops for more options, more utilitarian options.
Mm-hmm. And cargo bikes, which is another kind of...
Yes.
That's very Dutch. Also very Danish. So that kind of brings me into Copenhagen. So in the introduction to your book, you do have this paragraph where you could actually write a whole book on this, but about the difference between not Denmark essentially, but because it is very much Copenhagen, is where it's that's where the cycling takes place in Denmark rather than the whole country. And I don't want to use the word disparaging of Copenhagen, because that clearly will set off all sorts of alarm bells. But you are slightly dismissive, shall we say, about Copenhagen compared to the Dutch example. Just talk us through that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we come back to is that Copenhagen has been very good at marketing themselves. Sure, they have incredible cycling numbers and they're a wonderful place to ride bikes and they've got this great cycling culture. But as you've just said, it's one city, whereas the Dutch have an entire nation that has been doing this for decades. And the Dutch, unfortunately, haven't been very good at celebrating that story. And so that's part of why we wanted to tell the story that we did, is just letting people know that there is this like countrywide example of how we can build our cities for cycling.
The stat that we use in the book, and it still blows my mind every time I repeat it, but everyone talks about how there's more bikes than cars in Copenhagen, and the Dutch quietly are sitting on this fact that there's 202 different Dutch cities, towns, and villages where bikes outnumber cars, but the Dutch are so understated and so humble that they don't think that this is a remarkable achievement. And so we really felt compelled to share their story as a cycling nation and point out that they've done it in a variety of contexts and a variety of scales. And it's not just the big cities. They've done it in small cities and mid-sized cities. And really, as we say, it's not just copying and pasting one form of infrastructure, as maybe certain people suggest that it is very context-based and a very prescriptive approach, and they really, have achieved some tremendous successes, and we have a lot to learn from that.
So I want people to buy your book, and I want people to know more about what's in there. So I've got the list of chapters here. So there are 10 chapters. Can you summarize each chapter, and I will tell you which chapter I'm talking about, and just briefly describe what each chapter is about. See, we can't obviously, I don't know how many words are in your book, 100,000 words. We can't obviously discuss every single word in the book and give away every snippet. But if you just give a brief flavour of what each chapter is about. So starting with the first one, streets aren't set in stone.
Well, basically the theme of that chapter is that, exactly as the title says, our streets are not set in stone. They can be changed, and we can make them one way and then recognize that they could be a better way and change them again. And Rotterdam and New York City provide the examples for how that can be done, both in a historical and a more present context.
Not sport, transport. We've kind of talked about it, but can you expand on that one? Chapter number 2.
We look at the barriers to kind of the mass uptake of cycling in North America that's not specific to the infrastructure. So the idea of riding a bike for transportation, how the retail industry and manufacturing industry perhaps can play a role in that. And then we finally explore how electrification is bringing more people into cycling and perhaps is a tool to get more people riding more often.
Third chapter, fortune favours the brave. It's spelt wrong. Favours has got a U in it, by the way. But anyway, carry on. Fortune favours the brave.
As a side note, that was very difficult for us, Carlton, to write in American style. So
I know. I had exactly the same problem. I'm kind of ribbing you for that reason.
So that chapter is entirely focused on political bravery. We look at the Groningen context in terms of Max van der Burg, who came in with this grandiose idea that seemed crazy and ended up making Groningen one of the best cycling cities. And then what that looks like in North America, and we come to our hometown of Vancouver and what's happened here politically to get us from where we were 10 years ago with no cycle tracks to where we are now.
With how many miles?
Oh, how many miles? I don't know.
Kilometers. I don't know how many. What do you use?
Yeah.
Oh.
What is happening?
Isn't it 400 miles? Isn't that the normal?
That would include all the bicycle boulevards and painted bike lanes. And I couldn't even begin to guess because we're building new like 4 new cycle tracks as we speak. So the progress and over that decade has been absolutely phenomenal. And, we've probably got several dozen fully separated bike lanes that stretch across the city now at this point. And they've all been built in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Fabulous. Chapter 4, one size won't fit all.
So we really get into the kind of brick and mortar of Dutch infrastructure, talking about the Crow manual and the various classifications of roads and types of infrastructure they build, the way they treat intersections, and then looking at how the city of Austin, Texas has started working with the Dutch embassy to implement a Dutch-inspired network. And that all comes back to capturing these short 3-mile and under trips that the Dutch do so well.
And Demand More, 5th chapter.
That chapter is all about citizen activism, hyper-centralized to the fights that happened in Amsterdam in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in terms of pushing back to modernist design, pushing their politicians to rethink their streets, including, some pretty drastic measures like die-ins and pointing out the number of children that were being killed by cars every year. And then we look at Boston, where our friend Jonathan Furtig, who has moved from there since, but was at the time, basically doing the same thing as a very grassroots effort to get the city of Boston and the politicians to recognize that their streets weren't good enough and they weren't safe, and finding tactical urbanist ways of making the point and helping promote change.
Which, of course, is another Island Press book.
Yes.
That's correct. Yeah.
So, chapter 6, Think Outside the Van.
That chapter is all about the backfeeds and how the cargo bike, which was kind of lost for several decades, has made a bit of a comeback starting in 2001, both for personal family use, but also now in recent years we're seeing it in logistics organizations, so moving freight from Albert Heijn, the local grocer, that's shipping crates of groceries around Amsterdam, to the Coca-Cola company, which is now servicing its vending machines with a cargo bike full of tools. And finding a parallel in North America was a little bit tricky, but we shine a light on the cargo bike scene in Portland, Oregon, and how some different cargo bike manufacturers and freight companies have popped up there in their kind of vibrant bicycle culture.
And chapter 7, Build at a Human Scale.
That chapter is all about Utrecht, which was our favorite city, and really, delving into the history of the city, and also, pointing out that they were starting to make some mistakes in their ill-fated highway from nowhere to nowhere. But really examining how, again, citizens pushing back, and also local organizations, all without knowing, working towards the same goal. We're all focused on building a human-scale city, so a city where their downtown is completely car-free and enjoyed by everybody. And, to us, that city is just the perfect example of what a small, compact, livable place can be. And then we look at, in terms of that, recognizing the highway fight, looking at San Francisco, who is currently re-examining, while at a larger population scale, still a fairly compact city, and recognizing that some of the spaces that they've built for cars could be retrofitted, some forcibly retrofitted due to the tragic earthquake they had in the 90s, but also, looking at some of the other infrastructure they have along the waterfront and how that can be improved.
Okay, and chapter 8, which you have entitled Use Bikes to Feed Transit.
Yeah, that was a fun chapter to write, because it's really one thing the Dutch excel at, and perhaps one of the more valuable lessons for sprawling North American cities is the way that the Dutch have used bicycles to feed the transit system, and also used the transit system to fill the cycleways. And the statistic that always does the rounds is that half of all train trips in the Netherlands start with a bike ride.
So an awful lot of advocates in many countries, certainly in the UK, they try and get train companies to take bikes, and that's like their modus operandi. And yet when you go to the Netherlands, you get maybe 3 or 4 bikes on a train, that's it. It's all, these hire bikes at the station. So that they're actively, Ned Railways are actively trying to get people not to bring bikes on trains.
Yeah,
so it's a completely different approach.
It's an important distinction. And I think, one that we advocate for is not allowing bikes on trains, because it's rather inefficient use of rather expensive, platform and car space. It's not a scalable solution. So we reference Copenhagen again, perhaps in a disparaging way, but only 15% of people arrive to the train station by bike. And that is in part because they allow bikes on their trains there. And once those trains are full, there's no way to scale up from there. So by allowing for secure bicycle parking at the train station and encouraging people to leave their bike there, and then providing a last mile solution on the other side with the OV feets, it's a much more efficient and scalable system, and economic as well, and one that we would certainly advocate for.
Okay, and chapter 9, put your city on the map.
Oh, that one. We kind of explore a relatively newer phenomenon of putting in bike bling. So essentially building these massive infrastructure projects that are, well, not massive, but putting in infrastructure projects that are quite flashy and attractive. In the city of Eindhoven, they put in the Hovenring, which is a solution for like a transportation solution in terms of a problem that existed at an intersection, but in a way that essentially put them on the world scene. I think prior to that, nobody really knew who or where Eindhoven was. But how we need, it's great to have those projects, those prestige projects, but do it in a way that makes sense for the network and making things more accessible. And then we look at a North American example in Calgary of how the Peace Bridge, which was their first piece of beautiful architecture, sort of spurred bicycle solutions and transportation solutions in a city that, for most Canadians, we would not associate with active transportation.
Okay, in your final chapter, even though there is a conclusion and about the authors and acknowledgements, etc., but the final chapter with a number on is Learn to Ride Like the Dutch. What's that about?
Yeah, we wanted to kind of round out the book by getting into why the Dutch cycle beyond the kind of obvious urban planning and design decisions. So this idea of education and encouragement that exists there. And so that's where we spoke to Angela about the program she runs for teaching immigrants and refugees, and then somebody at the Fietsesbond about the classes that they offer and the examinations of children to get a nice diploma and learn the rules of the road, and so they're set up with a set of skills to cycle at a very early age, and we feel that's an important part of rediscovering the bicycle as a mode of transportation here in North America, and so we looked at Seattle as a burgeoning idea that they've built a couple of these traffic gardens, which were actually inspired by Copenhagen. So we'll give them props where it's due, and they're providing, I guess, a middle ground between the classroom and the real world for people or children mostly, to learn how to negotiate streets and ride a bicycle. So we wrapped up the book with this analogy. We were speaking to our friend Leonard, who has worked both professionally as a cycling planner in the Netherlands and in New Zealand, and he kind of made this point that the Dutch, an analogy that the Dutch are an older married couple, and these more new, exciting cycling cities are a young couple that are in love, and that the Dutch have, as this older, wiser couple, have a lot to teach this younger couple about relationships or cycling in this analogy. We certainly would believe that the Netherlands has a lot to teach these new cycling cities, but
we also have a lot of ways that we can forge new paths based on that wisdom that they have to provide.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I don't know how much of this was deliberate, but each time I asked you to describe the chapter, you each took one in turn. Now, that's obviously a wonderful description of your married life. However, how did you write the book? What was the mode of writing it? Did you each write a chapter and then somebody else wrote another one, or did you talk around this, or was there one person who actually writes it all and the other person doesn't? Describe how you physically wrote this book as a married couple.
Well, we did almost every interview together. And then basically we split up each chapter 50-50. So we would each sort of take a topic. A lot of times that was a little more challenging for us because, you inherently have certain interests based on your worldview. And while Chris and I share a lot of the same lifestyle, we have different perspectives. And so we would split each chapter up using that as the guide. Chris would transcribe an interview or transcribe and write half. I would transcribe and write half, and then we'd come together and go through it. So it was a bit of a laborious process, but it gave us a chance to both have equal impact on the story that we told and be able to merge our language in a way that would make it more accessible for our readers. And I think it worked out pretty well.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we can say that, we both contributed 50%, and we hope that it reads as one kind of consistent voice. But we kind of both brought, as you said, our complementary strengths and weaknesses and interests and passions and areas of focus, and it kind of just beautifully intertwined into this narrative that we hope people really enjoy.
Yeah, one of the things that we like to joke around about is that Chris approaches things much more technically and wonky, if you will, and I approach it much more from an emotional and feelings kind of level, and then we sort of balance it out from there.
That sounds almost the perfect way of writing a book. So you've got the kind of the yin and the yang, and the kind of the male and the female, if you want to go down that way. So you've got something that's absolutely meeting in the middle, and it's a marriage, a genuine, literal and metaphorical marriage.
Yeah, I guess.
we hadn't thought about it that way, but it's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you were absolutely thrilled when you physically saw, because I know I am, physically saw the real thing in the flesh. And it's soon going to be winging its way out there to people out in the great wild world. But you're also taking this on the road. So you are going out and you are talking about your book in a variety of, by the look of it, cities around the world. So just tell us about your speaker tour, where you're going and when you're going.
So we're starting out heading back, what is back east for us? So we're on the West Coast and we're going back to our hometown of Kitchener, Kitchener, Ontario, but starting out in Guelph and doing a bit of an Ontario and Quebec tour. And then we're going to end up doing the eastern seaboard of the U.S. And so that's sort of the initial 2-week tour. I think we've got how many cities? 8 cities. So Guelph, Ontario, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and DC. And then we come back home to Vancouver and do a few engagements here. We're also going down to Seattle in the early fall. And then excitingly enough, we get to take the book across the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand later on in the fall late fall, and share our story with audiences in Bendigo, Australia, Perth, Sydney, Brisbane, Auckland, and also potentially Wellington and Christchurch. So really taking it all over and then seeing where we go from there. It's an exciting
Christchurch
opportunity.
was a big cycling city. Do you know that? It was a huge...
Which one, sorry?
Christchurch was the cycling city of New Zealand. It was more Dutch than the Dutch in the 1930s. So it was a huge cycling culture.
We did a short tour of New Zealand a few years ago, but we weren't lucky enough to make it to Christchurch. So we're really excited to actually visit this time around.
So what about the UK and perhaps even more importantly, what about the Netherlands?
We've had some inquiries, and I think we're tentatively looking at a European tour in early 2019, but it will depend on funding. As you know, Carlton, we have written for a nonprofit, and they've been wonderfully supportive and helpful where they can, but author promotion is not one area where they have a lot of resources. So we're basically self-financing and self-organizing, which has caused a lot of gray hair and a lot of stress because
come on, you're already gray.
we're simultaneously planning, a dozen different events in a dozen different cities, and it's a lot of work. But we would really like to make it to the UK and definitely back to the Netherlands for a third visit in 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And let's describe where people can get this book, and then tell us about your social media personas, where people can hook up with you.
One of the easiest ways to find our book would be to go to islandpress.com. islandpress.org, where you can purchase the book direct from the publisher, but you can also find it on any book-selling site. So Amazon, which, as Chris mentioned, is not shipping till the release date on the 28th. You can also get it on Barnes & Noble, Indigo Chapters if you're in Canada. I'm not sure what the equivalent is in the UK.
All fine bookstores.
All fine bookstores.
And then digitally, it's also available as a Kindle file, yeah? As an ebook.
It is also available as an ebook.
And it will soon be available as an audiobook as well, which is quite exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. How is that being done?
The Island Press have partnered with a production company, and they've hired some voice talent, and the publisher's been taking care of it. So we don't know the details right now, but more details will be released closer to the August 28th.
I thought you were going to say you're going to do one chapter, Melissa does the next.
No,
your kids do the conclusion, kind of a complete family thing.
That would have been fun.
Yeah. I don't know when we would have fit it in, but that would have been a lot of fun. Sure. And then in terms of finding us, you can find us online at Modacity, MODACITI life.com, and the book information is all available there as well. And then on social media, we are at Modacity Life on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, all that fun stuff.
Perfect. Melissa, Chris, thank you ever so much for taking the time today. It is a fascinating and timely book from a wonderful publisher. I'm absolutely no skin in the game here. So thank you ever so much for chatting to me today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks, Carlton. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to Chris and Melissa Bruntlett there. I've included their social media handles and the details for their book on this show's website, which is the-spokesmen.com. That's also where you'll find the show notes for all of the 196 episodes of the Spokesmen Cycling podcast to date. Thanks for listening to the show. Thanks for subscribing to the show, even if episode 195 has yet to appear in iTunes. And thanks for telling your friends about the Spokesmen podcast. And hey, feel free to go write a review about the show on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. And then get out there and ride.